Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme. Now, it was one of the big promises in the Labour manifesto to fix the prisons crisis. The party, before the election, described the system as a powder keg ready to blow. Back in May, here's how Keir Starmer, then the opposition leader, grilled the then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on the specifics of his plan for prison reform.
Version 7.0 of his time in office doesn't extend as far as answering questions or giving any information on those prisoners he is releasing early. Basic details like how many, where are they, what crimes have they committed. So will he at least guarantee that none of the criminals he is instructing prisoners to release early are considered high risk?
Now, Starmer says tackling that problem is his most urgent priority. So we want to spend some time today just looking at what that problem is and what the solutions are. And those problems are immediate. Back in July, governors warned that the country's prison estate would effectively be full in the next week. It's now August. New legislation brought by Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood to the Commons will see the release of thousands of non-violent prisoners who have served 40% of their sentences. But the solution isn't as simple as early release. The Prime Minister has appointed businessman James Timpson as his prisons minister, and Timpson has a background in rehabilitation.
Now, according to a recent YouGov poll, only 1 in 6 people support the government's plan to release prisoners early. Labour has since said there'll be no early release for offenders jailed in connection to domestic abuse crimes. So the problems are massive. The solutions aren't that easy.
Let's speak to someone who can tell us a bit more about that system. Pia Sinha has worked in prisons for 24 years and is now the CEO of the Prison Reform Trust. Thank you for joining us, Pia. Can you help us understand the state of prisons in Britain today to start off?
Yes, thank you for having me. So the state of prisons and the crisis that we are being exposed to hearing about has been brewing for a number of years. So for those of us who were either in the system or who are working with the system, this doesn't come as a surprise. So that's the first thing to say. And the knowledge of the previous government of the fact that we were in this crisis state is not something that has taken them unawares. So it's been something that has been a very clear problem that has been flagging for a long time. What's happened over the years through a combination of factors, you have got essentially, you've got people who are getting longer and longer times in prison. So sentence inflation is causing less people to be coming out of the prison system, and equally through either a court backlog system because of COVID, because we are criminalising more individuals and we want to take the stance that we are tough on crime. You've got more and more individuals coming into the system. And what that has created over a period of time is an absolute bottleneck in our prisons, where you've got too many people coming in and too few people going out. And this is what's primarily fueling the crisis. And unless urgent emergency measures were taken to alleviate some of this fullness in our prisons, the whole criminal justice system would grind to a halt. Because unless you're able to receive people from courts coming into prisons who legitimately need to be there, you're essentially having to go back to the police and to courts to say, well, make fewer arrests, go through fewer people going through the court system, because you don't have anywhere safe to place them, and it becomes a public protection issue.
This is something, as you've outlined, that isn't necessarily a new problem in terms of overcrowding, but what's the risk right now, given where we've gotten to?
So the risk right now is that you're transferring the crisis in prison to a crisis in probation. So one of the biggest challenges that the government will have to face head on is that, yes, you alleviate the overcrowding pressure in prisons, but when you release a whole load of people early back into the community services, which are mainly probation and other voluntary sector agencies who are working on the outside of prisons, become very quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of people that they then have to manage in the community. So this is about people who need to be coming out on license, who need to be managed by the probation service. You also have an impending homelessness crisis because there aren't enough homes for people who are coming out. So all of the bit that happens in prisons, which is about resettling people once they come out of prisons, then becomes a massive issue.
So
the risk, to going back to your question, the risk then gets transferred from inside of prisons to the outside of prisons.
And on that, what practical steps then do you think are needed to go in tandem with this emergency release? How much more staff would be needed in probation? What are the kind of resources needed? We've just this week heard from Rachel Reeves that there is very little money and spare cash lying around. What kind of resources are organisations like yours lobbying for to make sure this isn't a disaster?
Yes, it's an excellent question. And I think that what we need to do with probation are a skilled professional group. They go through qualifications that get them to become probation officers, but that qualification process is over a year long. So committing to have more probation officers, whilst that's good, it's not something that you can turn the tap on and fill instantly. So that process takes time. What you need to do with probation officers is to look realistically at their caseloads. So you have in amongst the people that get released, you have low risk people, you have medium risk people, you have high risk people. And currently the probation service is overwhelmed because they have a duty to look after people on license, no matter how long their sentence has been whilst they've been inside, or how high risk they might be, or how low risk they might be. And first of all, that process where you're just churning through people coming through and who are on your caseload means that you're not effectively doing any risk management anyway. So the solution, or one of the solutions, needs to be to take a real hard look at our risk management procedures and be able to sift out who actually needs some quality time with probation so that they can be monitored and their risk managed appropriately on release, and who doesn't. And for that group that don't need that level of supervision, there needs to be a deprioritization of those cases. And side by side to that, for those individuals who don't need those risk management or those intense risk management procedures, it needs to be more practical help around their housing, around employment, around maintaining family contact, around treatment for substance misuse and alcohol services. Those kind of things are the factors that will reduce their risk of coming back in.
I appreciate the detail and the level of information you're giving us on what's needed, but that all of that will take time and will take money to establish. What should we be quantifying? How soon could this problem be fixed, and how much money is it likely to cost?
Well, I think that side by side, immediately, if you are kind of releasing huge numbers of people out in the community, you need to look at reducing caseloads of probation officers. That's something that can be done fairly swiftly by deprioritizing caseloads, which means that there'll be a whole number of individuals who don't need to be managed by probation. And as far as the resource goes, it costs something like £50,000 to have a person in prison for a whole year. You need to redirect some of that money by investing that in community services that are about diversion. So look at what the underlying reasons are for why people are drifting into custody in the first place, and invest that money, or a proportion of that money, out in the community so that those services can be strengthened. So part of the reason why you have so many people coming into the prison system is because other services that could have been implemented upstream of that process are not operating as they should. And this is why people are ending up in prisons, because that's the only place, it's their last chance saloon. So if you work out and do the maths, especially now that we're in this economic crisis, do the maths which says that this is how much it costs to have a person in prison. If we factor in taking a proportion of that amount of money and reinvesting it upstream in diversionary services, you will get a win-win situation, because the biggest point of that is that when someone is diverted in that way and their underlying issues are addressed through treatment programs and a suspended sentence, they're less likely to reoffend. So you stop this conveyor belt of people going into prison, losing all the anchors on the outside, not getting treatment for why they were offending in the first place, and then them coming back in and circling back in. So it needs some courage, and it needs some brave decisions about what needs to happen. But economic argument is the most compelling argument in this situation.
Well, look, you've given us some, as you called them, brave, practical choices they could make. And by looking at their appointment of James Timpson, who has very well-known rehabilitation-ish views, the government have signalled that they quite likely align with some of your views on this issue, Pia. But, and I think it's a big but, as someone who has looked at the Labour manifesto and seen them campaign and look at how they've said they're going to be tough on crime and cited Keir Starmer's record as the deputy head of public prosecutions have the party and the politicians done the hard work of convincing the general public that this is the right path to take?
Well, I think that's where the courage comes in, and the tough on crime rhetoric is partly responsible for creating this overcrowding in our prisons in the first place. And I think what the public needs, though, is to have confidence in the alternatives to custody. So there needs to be some kind of campaign that looks at, having these evidence-based conversations with the public about, what is actually more cost-effective and what actually reduces reoffending. These are the two really important factors in this debate. One is that, it costs way too much money to put someone in prison for that entire tactic to be a waste of money. So if you are able to move away from the tough on crime rhetoric and talk about a pragmatic and evidence-based approach, which says that this is where your money goes and this is the impact that it has on reducing reoffending, I think I have faith in the British public to be convinced about those arguments. But what takes courage is to go there in the first place. And the other point is that the victim lobby in this country is strong. And I think that in order to bring them aligned with this process, the strong argument is that if you don't have prisons that form a rehabilitative purpose, you are essentially, having a risk that people who come out of that system unrehabilitated, more likely to create victims once they get released. So if you want to actually reduce people getting re-victimized, the tactic needs to be do what works, do what the evidence says will work, rather than lock them up and throw away the key, because that is an ineffective strategy.
Pia, you have a long experience in the prison system under both Labour and Conservative governments. This is an issue that's high on the political agenda now, but could very easily be knocked down. And possibly, do you worry that it'll be forgotten if another crisis faces this government?
Well, I think that this is the problem with just looking at demand management. So, if you are currently just looking at either having emergency measures that reduce demand and building more prisons, you can only stem the tide for so long. So this issue of a crisis is abated for now, but unless these sensible conversations take place, what you're doing is you're just delaying a crisis forming later on. So in maximum will give you a year or give you 18 months, and then we'll be back to this position again. So I don't think the prison crisis problem is going to go away. It will rear its ugly head again in a few months' time, unless we're able to reset our priorities.
Pia Sinha, CEO of the Prisons Reform Trust, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, indeed, Pia makes the point there as well that this is an issue that could bubble up again to the, headlines if it isn't dealt with in a short period of time. So plenty of food for thought there. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and Bashara Oladele, and our audio engineer was Yuan. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.